They say the night is when the world finally exhales. But in the Wild West, it was more like a wheeze. And not the charming kind. Imagine curling up under a thin wool blanket that smells vaguely of damp squirrel, on the rocky edge of a prairie full of creatures that haven't yet evolved the courtesy of silence. The night wind whisks around badly nailed shack walls or low canvas tents, sounding suspiciously like it's trying to gossip with the tumbleweeds. Sleep, in that setting, was more of a dare than a daily occurrence. It's easy to forget today, surrounded by down comforters and apps that simulate rainfall, that for much of frontier America, nightfall didn't signal peace. It signaled preparation, and not of the cozy sort, unless your idea of relaxation involves chopping extra wood in partial darkness because the mercury just dropped 16 degrees in 10 minutes. Let's start with a place that almost no one wanted to stay the night in, Kansas. In the 1860s, parts of Kansas looked like an ocean made entirely of grass. Tall, sweeping green blades swayed in an indifferent wind. It was beautiful, yes, but dangerously so. Because once the sun dipped below the lonesome horizon, temperatures often plummeted like a drunk prospector trying to bathe in a frozen creek. And bedding, oh, that was a luxury. If you were lucky, you had some coarse cloth stretched over straw. If not, you layered yesterday's travel clothes, stuffed hay inside them, and hoped no rodents were already doing the same. It wasn't just the cold that made nights in the West something between a challenge and a myth. There weren't weather forecasts, of course. There were knees that told you a storm was coming, and campfire legends of sudden blizzards that fell upon wagon trains like the sky had changed its mind about the whole pioneer idea. Entire settlements learned the hard way that walls needed thick insulation, even if that insulation had to come from stuffing buffalo hides between the logs. Very warm, moderately smelly, wildly flammable. Now, while you count imaginary buffalo, it might help to picture an old cowboy settling in for the night. His hat stays on, not because it's stylish, but because it's the warmest thing he owns that fits his head and somewhat muffles the howling wind. He scraped together a fire, guarded it with stones, and he's crouched beside it, muttering to himself about them chill winds coming down from Canada like they own the place. He's got a pot of something on, a mysterious stew that may include beans, jerky, and something he thought was a mushroom, but might have been a shoe. You wouldn't believe the number of diaries where pioneers talked more about their beds than their travels. One exhausted settler wrote that he built his bed out of old fence posts and overwashed trousers. It does not keep me warm, but it does insult the wind most effectively. The wind, by the way, had many nicknames. The Whisper, the Thief, even that darn Screamer. It could steal the heat from a fresh cup of coffee before the steam had time to look dramatic. It howled down chimneys like a pack of bored ghosts, and it turned every creak of the house into a potential bear invasion. It usually wasn't a bear, usually. And so, people became very creative sleepers, curling their bodies close to the hearth, laying bricks near the fire to warm them, and slipping those into their beds like bedtime companions with all the charm and personality of a very cooperative brick. They stuffed socks with hot ash, it's as romantic as it sounds, and used dogs as heated footrest, or occasionally pillows if the dog was big and less squirmy. The smart townsfolk often ended up in boarding houses or tiny one-room structures stacked tight with feather mattresses. But even then, it wasn't uncommon for your nose to freeze while your feet sweat under 7 layers of hand-stitched quilts. That's the West for you, an ambivalent furnace with a drafty attitude. And yet, every morning, they woke up, or, more realistically, they gave up on sleep sometime near dawn, stretched their still shivering limbs, and welcomed another day of blinding sunlight and dry toast. Because in a world without central heating, or central anything really, surviving the night wasn't just about staying warm. It was about staying inventive, staying alert, and occasionally staying buried under 3 siblings and an aunt, just to split the body heat. If these stories helps you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now rest, weary traveller. Soon, we'll follow the flicker of lantern light towards a place where the walls creak not from wind, but from breakfast ambitions. The first cold wind of dusk curled through the canyons like a nosy old dog sniffing out campfires and seasoned beans. In the Wild West, nightfall wasn't just the sun clocking out. It was a shift change for the dangers that preferred moonlight. Coyotes got chatty, owls took over the gossip beat, and all the things with fangs, triggers, or poor impulse control seemed to stretch their legs. But in that strangely golden hour before it all turned pitch black, cowboys and pioneers alike sprang into action with the buzzing urgency of a frontier ballet. Choreographed by survival, performed in layers of wool. You see, darkness in the Wild West wasn't just inconvenient. It was lethal in that charmingly nonchalant way that only nature and unsharpened axes can manage. Evenings cooled down faster than a poker player's smile after a losing hand, and without proper shelter, or at least a well-behaved blanket, a person could go from chilly to pioneer popsicle by the time the moon climbed over the hills. So how did they survive? Ingeniously. And by ingeniously, we mean with equal parts desperation, determination, and duct tape made of animal fat and cussedness. Start with the bedroll, the cowboy's burrito of survival. Rolled tighter than a banker's wallet, and usually composed of one scratchy wool blanket, a saddlebag full of regrets, and maybe, just maybe, a bit of canvas tarp. It was neither warm nor waterproof nor breathable, but it had the distinct advantage of being better than death, which was a surprisingly popular metric back then. Blankets weren't just blankets, of course. They were also cloaks, pillows, privacy screens, and if needed, makeshift armor against hostile mosquitoes the size of thimbles. Wool was king, if not for comfort, then for its remarkable ability to hold warmth and smell like a sheep's diary, even after weeks of hard use. Traders hawked Hudson's Bay point blankets like they were selling dreams, and depending on the night, they were. Beyond that, the savvy Western traveler needed fire, not a flickering romantic candlelight. We're talking proper fire, the sort that crackles like a gossiping neighbor and throws heat faster than a gambler on the run. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was protection, companionship, and a crude sort of television, if you squinted into it hard enough and told a lively story. Making fire, however, had complications. Matches were precious. The matchbook wasn't invented until well past the era of buffalo and buggy wheels. Earlier matches often failed spectacularly, creating more smoke and profanity than flame. So many relied on flint and steel, sparked into a waiting mountain of dry moss, bone-dry grass, or whatever wasn't too wet, poisonous, or smelly. A successful fire sparked tiny whoops of celebration that frightened nearby rabbits and mildly discouraged ghost stories. Once that fire got going, a lucky traveler might heat some beans, soften their boots, and dry their socks. Not in that order, and never, Too close to the flame unless you wanted your toes roasted like marshmallows, minus the sweetness. Of course, even with fire and blankets, the cold was insistent. One clever solution? The timeless art of cuddling your horse. Yes. Horses were not just transportation. They were mobile sleeping heaters, albeit ones that snored and occasionally wandered off for greener pastures at precisely the wrong moment. Sharing body heat was a tool of last resort, and the horse, for its part, was not always enthusiastic, but it was honest work. And then there was ingenuity. Some dug shallow sleeping trenches to block the wind. Others layered pine boughs beneath their blankets for insulation. Although separating the pine sap from one's hair afterward was a personal adventure in modest hygiene. Cowboys might even tuck hot stones, pulled carefully from campfires, into their beds as frontier water bottles. It was a little theatrical and slightly dangerous, which made it precisely on theme. But even among the grizzled and the resourceful, everyone had the same unspoken nighttime wish: to wake up, alive, warmish, and preferably unnibbled. A west wind could carry coyotes, frost, or just bad dreams. But so long as your fire crackled, your boots stayed semi-dry, and your horse hadn't eloped with your bedroll, you'd call it a successful night on the trail. And as the prairie stars blinked awake and cold dust whispered down from the hills, one thing rang true. Surviving the night wasn't about toughness. It was about out-scheming the cold with just enough warmth to dream another day. Next, under those same starlit skies, we'll wander into the shivering poetry of frontier architecture. The log cabins, sod houses, and wind-battered hideouts that tried their best to keep the cold out and the warmth somewhere in the walls. Or so they hoped. Snowflakes have a peculiar sense of comedic timing, especially when you're 200 miles from the nearest general store and your socks are made of hope and poor decisions. In the Old West, winter didn't come with sleigh bells and cinnamon-scented romance. It came with a vengeance and frostbite. As the first chill of dusk wrapped its fingers around the prairie, a cowboy's choices grew narrower than a saloon lady's patience on a payday. You could pile buffalo hides on yourself until you resembled a very sullen casserole. Or, and this was the brave option, you could try to outwit the cold with a campfire and a prayer. Most opted for both, with varying degrees of scorch marks. The art of surviving a western night wasn't just about keeping warm. No, that'd be too simple. It was about outmaneuvering the cold, without accidentally inviting some other peril to your party, like hiking up so many clothes you couldn't draw your pistol, only to be ambushed by a raccoon with poor impulse control. Blankets were the currency of comfort. Wool was the gold standard, of course. And if it came from back east, carried over the Rockies on the back of a determined mule named Consuela, it might as well have been royalty. Trappers wrapped themselves in layers upon layers, sometimes sleeping inside their coats like oddly committed burritos. Then there were the fires. Oh, the dance of the flame in the wind-whipped dusk. Building one was more than practical. It was a little display of frontier theatre. You had to find dry wood without becoming dry wood yourself. Light it without surrendering your fingers to the wind. And then monitor that flicker all night, lest it grow bored and wander under your bedroll in a fiery tantrum. Stories from the time tell of folk sleeping with hot stones wrapped in old handkerchiefs or stuffing spare saddle blankets under coats and up pant legs, creating a sort of pioneer Michelin man silhouette. Some slept close to their horses, either for warmth or because they owed them emotionally after a particularly rough river crossing. And then there was the meat, blanket. Let us pause here. The meat blanket was not a luxurious swath of steak-themed flannel, although, let's be honest, the marketing potential is immense. Rather, it involved positioning yourself next to your trail partner, usually out of necessity, not affection. Personal space evaporated when temperatures dropped below your self-esteem. 2 body heats were better than 1, especially if both had managed to not fall in a creek that day. There were also more creative approaches, like burying oneself in the snow, Inuit style, to use its insulating properties. You had to dig a little hollow, pack it gently down, then lie inside like a sleepy popsicle. Of course, if you sneezed, your snow roof caved in with a polite thump and the mild tragedy of a frozen moustache. Some travelers swore by nightcaps, not the fuzzy kind, but the whiskey type. They claimed a splash of bourbon before bed would keep the chill at bay. It did, briefly. Then your blood vessels opened right up, gave the cold a warm hug, and promptly dumped you into a deeper shiver. Medicine or myth, no one cared much by 2 a.m. Interestingly, native peoples out west, long accustomed to the whims of wilderness winters, fared far better. They'd perfected teepee insulation techniques, developed body wrapping styles rivaling Swedish knitwear designers, and generally had the good sense not to sleep directly under trees famous for enthusiastic snow dumps. Meanwhile, newcomers from cities like Boston or Philadelphia had to learn quickly, or freeze like cautionary statues, arms forever outstretched in regret. Even the animals had cleverer strategies. Prairie dogs snoozed in elaborate underground condos warmed by cleverly designed spiral vents. Bears took the diplomatically sound approach of skipping winter entirely. Only humans had the prideful notion of fighting the cold toe-to-toe, usually with frostbitten toes. And yet, in spite of the danger, the cold sharpened the stars above them. The silence of a winter night on the plains was endless and forgiving. Once the fire's crackle settled into background music, and your last swig of weak coffee had gone bitter, the only thing left was the hush, and the knowledge that, somehow, you had endured another moonless evening in the wilderness, maybe grudgingly, maybe with a cold nose, but still, alive. Tomorrow might bring warmer winds, fresh tracks in the snow, or even the luxury of a half-frozen biscuit. But for now, against all odds and thermometers, sleep crept in gently, warmed not by fire alone, but by the absurd resilience of frontier dreams, and tucked deep beneath a pile of saddle blankets, with stars for a ceiling and coyotes singing lullabies in the distance. The night rolled on, whispering softly toward the next accidental invention of cowboy comfort. Nightfall on the American frontier had a curious way of making grown men regret not hugging their mamas more often. In the wide, open spaces of the wild west, the sun didn't set. It plummeted. One moment, you might be winking at golden meadows and the distant silhouette of a slow-moving mule, and the next, you were plunged into a velvet cold that could bite through buckskin and leave you wondering whether your toes were still technically affiliated with your body. Now, before we bring you too deep into the nighttime woes of a stubborn cowboy with frostbit ankles, let's rewind to the less than glamorous accommodations of your average frontier settler. Forget the Hollywood saloon filled with oil lantern ambience and fiddle music. Most folks trying to tame the West didn't even have 4 walls, let alone a hearth and a rocking chair. No, many pioneers found themselves bedding down in hastily assembled sod houses, structures so humble they made garden gnomes weep in pity. These sod homes were built, quite literally, from the earth. Grass, dirt, roots, and peerless optimism. If you'd asked a 19th century family how their new house was going, chances are they'd answer, "Well, it doesn't leak much this week." At night, the temperature plummeted faster than your hopes during a square dance rejection. With no central heating, because fire hadn't yet figured out how to network with pipes and radiators, folks did their best to preserve body heat using a tried and true method, piling everyone into one bed like mismatched spoons in a drawer. That included Ma, Pa, the kids, the baby, and occasionally a goat with no sense of boundaries. To further fortify their nightly defenses, some pioneers would bank their fires, essentially a strategy that involved piling hot coals under ashes so they'd still be alive by morning, like the embers of an awkward family feud. But if the fire died out, which it often did, well, then it was you, your scratchy wool blanket, and the persistent winter breeze conducting a deeply personal relationship through every crack in the wall. And that's if you had walls. Now, let's talk about cowboys out on the range. Romanticized in songs and suspiciously clean Western films, cowboys often worked cattle drives that stretched hundreds of miles across hard, empty land. There were no inns, no bathhouses, very few sympathetic ears. At night, a cowboy on the trail had three main companions: his horse, his hat, and whatever he could fashion into a pillow without offending his vertebrae. Blankets were precious. Bedrolls were crucial. And his hat? Well, besides serving as sunblock, drinking cup, and emergency squirrel deterrent, it often doubled as a face warmer when the frost crept along his cheeks like nosy little ghosts. The phenomenon of cowboy coffee emerged from these frozen twilight rituals. Brewed over an open fire in something that may or may not have started its life as a boot, this viciously strong beverage was less a drink and more of a warm slap to the soul. It helped the cowboys stay awake on guard duty, where they'd scan the horizon for cattle rustlers, or just practice looking stoic under moonlight. But even the cattle were not exempt from the cold. To keep them from wandering off in the night, or turning into large ice sculptures, the cowhands would often sing to them. Yes, real lullabies, deep, slow, and repetitive tunes designed to keep the cattle calm and centered. After all, a panicked steer in the middle of the night could start a stampede, and nothing kills your bedtime mood like 32 head of beef taking off at a gallop because someone sneezed too loud. For those hardy enough to have wagons, the cold still called the shots. Canvas coverings offered all the insulation of a paper napkin in a snowstorm. Families would huddle around cast iron stoves, small, soot-riddled things that ran on buffalo chips. And if you're wondering what a buffalo chip is, let's just say it's nature's very own cow patty power source. Efficient, smoky, fragrant. Still, the philosophy of the Old West wasn't about comfort. It was about surviving long enough to complain about it later in a rocking chair. And as the creak of frost-covered wagon wheels settled into silence, and the stars took their turn shining over the lonely plains, one thing was certain. The night belonged to those who knew how to outwit the cold with blankets, bannock, and a good old-fashioned grumble. Somewhere, a coyote called into the distance, or possibly laughed. It was hard to tell, but the campfire still flickered, and the promise of pancakes at dawn kept the shivering pioneers lingering in their dreams. Because as the dark hours deepened and the cold settled in like an uninvited in-law, they all knew. The night may not give you warmth, but it does make morning taste just a little sweeter. And as that prairie wind whispered through the grass like a well-meaning lullaby with frostbite, another unlikely invention dawned on the horizon. A curious thing made of canvas, rope, and contraption. The humble beginnings of the cowboy tent. As the golden sun dipped behind the Rocky Mountains and shadows stretched long across the plains, the West transformed. The landscape, which by day seemed filled with boundless opportunity and unbothered prairie dogs, became by night one vast tapestry of uncertainty. The settlers who survived the daytime rattlesnakes and squabbling over whose mule was more stubborn now faced a challenge far more primitive: not freezing to death. You see, in the Wild West, weather wasn't something to chat about politely. It was something to survive. And nighttime cold wasn't just chilly air whispering sweet nothings into your tent flap. It was spiteful, vindictive. It crept under wool blankets like a cunning outlaw and made itself right at home in your boots. For those braving the frontier, nightfall meant wrapping yourself in everything you owned, including, if you were lucky, a buffalo robe that smelled like every road it had ever traveled on. No one was fashion conscious on the trail. They were frostbite conscious. And buffalo fur, while it wasn't exactly breathable or delicate, it did tend to keep vital limbs attached. But who really knew the tricks of the night better than anyone else? Enter the sometimes reclusive, always prepared mountain men. These rugged, bearded legends weren't just experts in trapping beaver and growing magnificent layers of frost on their eyebrows. They were survival encyclopedias with a taste for coffee boiled into oblivion. Take, for example, Jedediah Strong Smith. Yes, that was his real name. And yes, he lived up to every syllable. Jedediah could read a mountain like you or I might read a children's book, possibly even faster. He wore layers of stitched animal hide so thick he could probably bounce a flintlock pistol off his chest. Of course, the downside to this cozy armor was the smell. He once went 3 months without removing his boots. When he finally did, legend claims even the coyotes kept their distance. By contrast, newcomers, greenhorns fresh off riverboats or wagons, often believed they could outwit the night with sheer optimism. One particularly enthusiastic fellow from Baltimore arrived in Wyoming territory one autumn and declared, "If it gets chilly, I'll just jog in place." He was later found inventing the foxtrot by himself in a snowdrift. Cold wasn't just about discomfort, it was resource management theatre. If you wanted firewood, you'd better gather it before sundown. Wandering around with an axe under starlight wasn't seen as brave. It was seen as a good way to lose your nose, your toes, or your marriage, depending on what you promised back at the wagon. Fires, of course, played a starring role. Campfires weren't about roasting marshmallows, but rather not becoming a frontier popsicle. They had to be built low and smart, with stones arranged in tight configurations. Wiser than most of us arranging our bookshelves. A clever settler could even insulate the heat with dirt-packed sod walls, forming what might be generously called a thermal hug. And speaking of warmth, nothing beat the controversial but undeniably effective sleep sandwich. This had nothing to do with sandwiches or sleep in the traditional sense. It involved 3 people cramming tightly under the same blanket, and occasionally a dog, forming a survival burrito for the nocturnal wind to envy. A little awkward, admittedly, and you had to be truly comfortable with Hank snoring and Eliza's foot accidentally finding your face at 3 hours a.m. Blankets themselves were a luxury. Quilts lovingly stitched from whatever cloth wasn't currently holding up someone's trousers were passed down like family treasures. If you had an oilcloth tarp, tattered though it may be, you were in the upper crust of outdoor elegance. Silk pajamas, kindly tuck those away with your optimism about jogging in the snow. In some cases, frontier folks carried heated stones wrapped in cloth inside their bedding, primitive hot water bottles with all the charm and risk of a dragon nap. Others attempted Scandinavian tricks like sleeping between two cowhides. Instead, they usually just ended up smelling Scandinavian. There's something rather poetic about how the unforgiving, dark-forged camaraderie, whether you were a lonesome trapper, a bundled-up pioneer mother, or some mustachioed cowboy soulfully strumming a frozen guitar. Nighttime survival was never a solo art. It was improvisational theatre, with equal parts shivering and swearing, held together by grit and a dash of frontier madness. As the stars blinked above like curious onlookers, and wolves howled somewhere beyond reach, settlers pulled their blankets tighter, not knowing what the next night would bring, but certain that for now the fire still glowed. Tomorrow's tale, like the trail ahead, promised more than just chill. By the time twilight spilled its purple ink across the sky, those who knew better in the Wild West weren't just admiring the view. They were tying up bootlaces, checking rifle chambers, and gathering anything dry enough to burn without sputtering like an indecisive ghost. Before electricity turned night into a mild inconvenience, best faced with a coffee and a backlog of mail. True darkness was a very serious contestant in the nightly game of survival. In the frontier, night meant danger. And the cold? The cold didn't care if you were outlaw, preacher, or a jittery gold prospector whose tent was mostly patchwork lies and wishful stitching. Cold didn't play favorites. Now, while cities back east were experimenting with gas lamps and early street lighting, dangerously bright invitations for moths and the morally confused, the frontier had to make do with lanterns, campfires, and the occasional irritable moonlight. Cowboys, for their part, tended to sleep, huddled up like puppies in a barn pile. Not out of affection, might they, least not that they'd admit, but because frostbite is remarkably democratic. Bunkhouse etiquette was simple. Clothes stayed on, boots stayed on, and if someone started snoring loud enough to spook the horses, you poked them with a stick and told them kindly to die quieter. Out on the cattle trails, cowhands took turns watching the herd under the stars. They called it standing night guard, but really it was more outdoor existential reflection with coyotes for background vocals. The job had one rule: keep the cattle calm, because when a 1,000-pound longhorn starts dreaming about snakes, you don't get a bedtime story, you get a stampede. So cowboys sang to them, soft, slow ballads, stretched like caramel on a warm rock. Songs were passed down not for their musical merit, but for rhythm. Cattle, it seems, found solace in a human voice humming something that sounded vaguely like a lullaby that got hit on the head. Think less Beyoncé and more. Historically exhausted, humming. It worked, most nights. And for the cowboy, singing delayed the cold from creeping in through chapped lips and half-buttoned shirts. The songs kept him awake, warmed him from the inside, and reminded him of shapes he missed. Hills back home, shapes that looked like mama's porch or someone's shoulder after 2 drinks and a dance. And then there was whiskey. Oh yes, the warm internal blaze of frontier logic in a bottle. Whiskey was the frontier's favorite blanket, medical cure-all and truth serum. Mix it with strong coffee and you got cowboy caffeine. Mix it with creek water and you got a stomachache worth writing letters about. But mix it with freezing night air and you had a way to forget the tips of your fingers. Folks in the West were no strangers to cold. High plains, mountain passes. It wasn't just the wolves making bedtime difficult. The wind had teeth, and your bedroll could betray you if you pitched camp on a forgetting hillside. One misplaced foot in the Sierra Nevada, and you might find yourself involved in a Donner Party reenactment, whether or not you had a ticket. Travelers, especially those trying to sleep on the move, came up with cozy innovations. Heated rocks were tucked into saddlebags or cradled like babies. Bedrolls were stuffed with buffalo hair or, if you were fancy, actual insulation. Newspapers were surprisingly useful. Wrapped around legs or stuffed into shirts, newsprint could trap heat and cause your torso to smell faintly like yesterday's politics. Even train robbers, those most fashionable rogues of the open frontier, preferred to hit payroll routes during daylight hours. Not because they were worried about witnesses, but because nobody wanted to gallop away from justice with frozen knees and icicles in their eyebrows. Justice wasn't blind out here. It just occasionally had frostbite. But perhaps the oddest part of frontier cold wasn't the big dramatic blizzards or lung-freezing gusts. It was the quiet. At night, when the sky opened up and the wind paused long enough for silence to settle in like a wise old uncle, you could hear everything. The crack of a twig, the uneasy huff of a sleeping animal, the shift of a horse in its sleep, a reminder that even mighty creatures dreamed, probably of better hay and fewer humans. And in those hushed moments, when a cowboy or traveler pulled his blanket tighter and gazed up at stars bigger than he'd remembered, the cold wasn't so much an enemy as it was a test. Not a test to win, really, but one to survive with your fingers, your stories, and your sense of humor intact. Which, conveniently, brings us to a very specific type of person who laughed in the face of hardship, shrugged off the cold like it owed them rent, and turned peculiar survival strategies into everyday legend. 2 pairs of socks. That was the magical number. In the vast, shivering wilderness of the American frontier, where snowdrifts crawled like sleepy cats across the prairie, and the wind had a nasty habit of whispering secrets through the chinks in your cabin walls, survival often came down to the simplest of arithmetic. 2 pairs of socks, the old-timers swore by it. Wear 1 pair during the day, rotate them over the fire at night, and switch. Anything less, and frostbite danced into your boots like an uninvited square dancer. Now, if you're imagining rugged cowboys cozied up in warm boots with modern insulation, allow me to gently pop that bubble like a soap one drifting over a potbelly stove. Footwear on the frontier was often whatever you could cobble together. Literally, cobble. And while leather boots sound romantic, they were about as waterproof as a colander if not well oiled, and they had the insulating capabilities of a teacup. So what did these frostbitten wanderers do? Some lined their boots with newspaper, or worse, old pages from dime novels. That's right. Tales of dashing gunslingers and tragic outlaws were sacrificed so that real ones could keep their toes. A plot twist, if there ever was one. Others used dry grasses or even rabbit fur, the rabbit not always agreeing to the arrangement, mind you. But boots were only part of the cold weather performance. Winter on the plains wasn't a spectator sport. It required layers, and not just clothing layers, but strategy layers, like a game of thermal chess with nature as your opponent. And she always played black. Take, for instance, the humble long johns, today's comfy winter loungewear, but back then, a matter of life or very unpleasant frostbite. Made of wool so itchy it probably inspired the phrase, "worse things have happened." These undergarments were rarely washed, often patched, and shared between brothers who had long since stopped respecting personal boundaries. Their ability to retain warmth was nearly magical, provided you could tolerate the scent, a pungent blend of sweat, campfire smoke, and whatever beans you could find by moonlight. Speaking of moonlight, let us not forget what passed for nighttime lighting. Lanterns flickered nervously, prone to going out if you looked at them wrong. Candles burned low and slow, and pitch darkness was a regular character at the tightly scripted drama of frontier survival. And it was in this flickering half-light that blankets became kingdoms. A man with 2 was a modest prince. A man with 3 was an emperor. But anyone with a buffalo robe, magnificent. A walking, snoring, slightly smelly fortress. Of course, not everyone had buffalo robes. They often required either trade or luck, or a very persuasive rifle. But those who did often kept them for decades, passing them down like heirlooms, complete with mysterious stains and whispered tales of the great blizzard of '81, when someone allegedly survived a 3-day freeze with nothing but a pot of beans and sheer stubbornness. And stubbornness was, perhaps, the frontier's coziest survival tool. Settlers, cowboys, trappers, they weren't just fighting weather, they were wrestling it. And when the cold tried to creep in under doors sealed with old quilts and animal hides, they didn't just shiver, they invented. Hot stone foot warmers, bottles filled with boiling water, dogs curled like donuts by the fire, and neighbors who sometimes let you borrow their warmth and their soup, if not their buffalo robe. Night, for them, was not a time to relax, but another shift in the endless job of staying alive. And yet, somehow, through the creaks and groans of makeshift beds, the whistle of wind, and the quiet crackle of a dying flame, sleep would find them. Maybe because when you've layered every sock, bartered every blanket, and said goodnight to the night with a growl instead of a prayer, you've already done enough. And as the snow piled up against the cabin walls outside, and the stars blinked like cold little candles above the prairie, warmth came not just from socks or soup, but from something else too. A sense that the danger had passed, at least until morning. Now, as we gently lift another woolen corner of this long night, let's wander further into the lives of those who walked thin lines between survival and sleep, and the curious company they kept. There wasn't much dignity in winter underwear back then. In fact, frontier folks wore so many woolen layers, you'd have been forgiven for mistaking a rugged cowboy for a mobile bale of hay. One with opinions on the price of beans. As December crept into the plains and snug little canyons, it brought with it a kind of silence that made every creak of a wooden floorboard sound like a gunshot, and every gust of wind seemed like a ghost rehearsing its lines. Out on the wild western frontier, surviving the cold was less about snuggling and more about strategic fluff. Quilts became a kind of folk engineering, glorious, lumpy fortresses of stitched-together salvation. Women would often patch quilts with whatever scraps they could find, flour sacks, old shirts, and, in at least one apocryphal instance, a pair of rather scandalously worn-out bloomers. But no one was picky in January. If it kept the frostbite off your toes, it was a family heirloom by New Year's Eve. Even the mighty wood-burning stove, that red-bellied beast of frontier survival, had its quirks. Kept burning as often as possible, it would groan with the weight of daily life. Biscuits, beans, boots drying nearby, and one large iron kettle forever filled with something vaguely edible. The placement of the stove often determined exactly how warm you'd be at bedtime. The trick was sleeping with your socks above the stove, but reaching them without setting your pants on fire remained a delicate art. Fireside seating formed a natural hierarchy. Children, pets, and elders got first rights. Everyone else, well, you'd become intimately familiar with the cold side of a cabin, and it had opinions. The truly prepared frontiersman, though, had an extra secret weapon, heated bricks. Wrapped in burlap and slipped under the covers before bed, a good hot brick could convince you, if only for a moment, that you weren't living inside a windswept box of chill despair. And bathing, a hilariously ambitious idea between November and March. Water froze faster than promises in a poker game, and indoors you might get a bucket bath in front of the stove, assuming you'd been very good. Otherwise, most folks just politely adjusted their social distance and powered through. There was something oddly communal about the shared seasonal stench, fragrant, familiar, and seasoned with determination. The Old West may very well have invented eau de persévérance. Outside, the cold wasn't just inconvenient, it was lethal. A man caught unprepared might literally freeze in place, mid-thought, mid-step, or mid-apology to a mule. Bitter winds ripped across the plains like unpaid debt collectors, and snowdrifts could bury livestock, fence posts, or small children who dared wander too far for snowball arguments. So, for the cattlemen and rangers, the cold months weren't time off. They were time on. Constantly on patrol, checking herds, chipping ice from watering holes, and ensuring none of the animals froze into tragic lawn ornaments. That's why night watches were rotated, often with such solemnity it might as well have been a military detail. A man pulled that duty wrapped in every article of clothing he owned, plus a few he borrowed from someone slightly smaller and much less pleased. Those out riding night watch often spoke of the sound of cold, a quiet crunch under hooves, the soft exhale of breath turned to fog, and creaking trees that sang just slightly off-key. The moon, when visible through the brittle air, seemed closer, like it was checking in. Still cold, it seemed to ask. "Oh yes," the cowboy would whisper, wool muffling his face, but not dead yet. Even the animals had tricks for staying warm. Horses would huddle, sometimes annoyingly so, creating what one cowboy described in his journal as a flannel catastrophe. Chickens roosted somewhere between organized chaos and poultry-driven science. And cats, those most cunning of frontier freeloaders, always managed to find the warmest nook near the stove, usually on a clean pile of laundry, which then wasn't. Winter loneliness could creep in like the draft beneath a half-hinged door. So folks played cards, shared exaggerated stories, and when desperate, visited neighbors for the thin excuse of returning a hammer. It wasn't so much what they did as the practiced rhythm of doing something. Anything to keep the long cold from feeling too enormous. A good laugh lasted longer than most candles, and tall tales burned better than timber, if you knew how to spin them. Somewhere in the middle of one such night, as boots steamed by the crackling fire and a dog snored with the decibel range of a distant train, a thought whispered through the logs. It's not the danger that wears you down in winter, it's remembering to laugh in spite of it. Outside, the stars glittered with frostbitten brilliance, and the wind curled through the brush like a forgotten sheriff hunting silence. And just beyond that quiet, something else was beginning. Something not quite sunrise, but not entirely night. The kind of moment where breath hangs in the air, waiting for what comes next. The prairie wind makes a sound not unlike a sigh from the earth itself, long, low, and maybe slightly disappointed in humanity's decision to put saloons in places with no plumbing. As the deep blues of nightfall crept over the wide open west, the real adventure began, trying to stay alive while your feet were slowly turning into meat popsicles. You see, when you're in the middle of nowhere, with only a canvas tent between you and the sharp teeth of the night, survival becomes an art form. an unpleasant, scratchy, frequently damp art form, like trying to finger paint with cold beans, and the hardy folks who dared to call this land home had to become masters. Pioneers and cowhands knew the first rule of surviving a western night: never underestimate what a desperate man will use as insulation. Worn-out flour sacks, buffalo hides, musty newspapers, pocket lint. If it could be layered, wrapped, or stuffed inside breeches, it definitely became part of someone's evening ensemble. Historical records note that in 1887, a trapper near the Dakota Territory allegedly slept in the hollow carcass of a mule during a blizzard, and frankly, no one ever challenged his campsite again. But the unsung hero of frontier bedtime was fire. Glorious, crackling, hypnotic fire. Not just for warmth, but for morale. A good campfire could do wonders for the soul. It kept your face warm, lit your chili pot, and gave you a place to stare dramatically while telling ghost stories about haunted outhouses. Campfire etiquette, by the way, was taken very seriously. One must never steal another man's log, blow stubbornly on someone else's embers, or rearrange their cooking rocks without written permission from a U.S. Marshal or divine revelation. Most cowboy bedrolls, known affectionately as snug sacks of regret, were made of canvas wrapped around a few questionably stained blankets. Some more sophisticated sleepers tucked heated stones inside their bedding. A delightful idea, until one accidentally tucked a scorpion in too. Nature, it turns out, had notes. And then there was the art of layering. Cowboys didn't have luxury brands or puffy jackets with names like Arctic Puffin, TM. No, they had wool, itchy, heavy, stubborn as a mule wool. Wool socks, wool undershirts, and sometimes, yes, wool mustaches if you'd leaned too close to the fire too often. Under that dusty hat slept ecosystems of pioneers battling frostbite by sheer force of stubbornness and body hair. Many slept in their boots not because it was comfortable, it wasn't, but because removing them meant wrestling a combination of mud, laces, and shame. Also, if something were to chase you at night, say a gang of bandits or a buck-naked miner screaming about gold gremlins, you didn't want to flee barefoot. Night watches were another silent struggle. In large wagon caravans, folks took turns keeping guard. Sleepy sentinels swaddled in buffalo coats would walk slow, creaky circuits around the perimeter. Eyes peeled for trouble, ears tuned to the strange symphony of coyote yowls, rustling sagebrush, and the sniffling of Old Man Schubert's seasonal allergies. And yet, amid all this, with the prairie frozen harder than Aunt Mildred's fruitcake, people found a rhythm. They slept in shifts, huddled together, sometimes even singing quietly to pass the darkest hours. Low, soothing tunes, mixed with mild wheezing and the occasional invented verse about shoes expressing their feelings. Mind you, cold wasn't the only concern. Ticks, moths, tumbleweeds, wild pigs with boundary issues, any of them could crash your snooze party. But with arms locked around a warm mug of boiled chicory rind and a sky above packed with more stars than a birthday cake in exile, there was an odd kind of peace. Maybe it wasn't softness these frontier folks sought at night, but stillness, the kind that only arrives after the horses are fed, the fire's crackling low, and your fellow wanderer has finally stopped snoring out folk songs through his nose. Sleep came gently then, wrapped in wool and willpower, a drifting surrender under skies that always kept their secrets. And somewhere, as frost glazed the northern horizon and coyotes began their opera of existential crisis, another kind of ritual was beginning, the ancient, noble, frostbitten search for breakfast. But that dear listener, is a waking story for another hour. There was a reason cowboys counted the stars before sleeping, because counting coyotes only made things worse. Out on the prairie, night didn't fall so much as tumble down like a forgotten quilt, cold and scratchy, heavy with silence. During daylight, the Wild West might have felt dry, dusty, and sun-baked. But once the sun clocked out, you were left in the company of frigid air, chirping crickets, and occasionally the unsettling cough of something large enough to be curious about your sleeping bag. For the average frontiersman or woman, nighttime meant shifting from survival mode to, well, slightly colder and more worried survival mode. You might think that people in the 1870s lacked weather apps, but they had far better instincts. They could smell snow in January, read the clouds like an open diary, and if their knees creaked, it was time to layer up. Bunking down under open skies was a bit like trying to nap in the world's largest freezer, without electricity or walls. If you were lucky, you'd find a downwind spot near a rock or some sad little shrub pretending to be a tree. Candles were a luxury, bedrolls never quite thick enough, and your boots often doubled as alarm systems for snakes. Yes, rattlesnakes occasionally liked to nap in warm crevices, like well-worn boots. It gave a whole new meaning to the term putting your foot in it. Campfires, that golden flickering beacon of hope, weren't just for evening songs and marshmallow-less desserts. They were strategic. A decent campfire had to be hot enough to warm your bones, but not blazing enough to invite every passing outlaw, bear, or wandering preacher. There's a fine line between heat and hospitality when you're alone in the wilderness. Now, the hardened cattle drovers had tricks of their own. Some carried flat, iron warming stones they'd tuck into a fire, then swaddle in cloth to place near their feet. Others dug shallow cowboy beds lined with spoils of nature. Grass, leaves, anything dry enough not to squeal when it got cold. And if you were particularly seasoned, you'd blend animal fat into the soles of your boots and the lapels of your coat, sealing in precious warmth and making yourself mildly unappetizing to predators. But even with ingenuity, the real battle was with sleep itself. A man's body might rest, but the ears stayed at attention. The howl of a wolf here, the eerie rustle of bushes there. Is that a breeze, a bison sneeze, or someone judging your campfire building skills from the darkness? No one could tell. For the brave, or perhaps foolhardy, who chose to spend their nights in the high altitude of the Rockies, sleep was like a game of hide and freeze. Temperatures could swing from gentle to gasp-inducing in mere hours. Blankets of snow could appear seemingly out of nowhere, as if the sky had politely decided, "Here, have a surprise." In mining camps, things were a bit different. The evening lullaby included throaty laughter, the clinking of whiskey bottles, and, occasionally, impromptu revolver poetry. Rooms were rented by the half-night, because sharing a bed and a blanket and a snoring partner named Clem was cheaper than catching frostbite. It wasn't unusual to find a dozen miners in a single bunkhouse, creating a kind of collective body heat system called "We'd prefer not to die tonight." Women traveling the territories had their own arsenal of survival. Quilting circles weren't just domestic pastimes. They were crucial moments to discuss how best to keep your children warm with limited supplies and several judgmental goats in attendance. Layers were life, and anyone with a petticoat stitched with wool batting was considered something of a textile wizard. And let us not forget the humble buffalo robe. Equal parts blanket, coat, and status symbol. These weighty hides could trap heat like a small oven and muffle even the gossipy whines of prairie wind. Wrapped in one, you might just dream of warm kitchens and apple pies. Without one, you might dream of becoming one with the snowdrift. But even as the cold pressed against ribs and frozen brows formed icicles of contemplation, there was a kind of quiet peace. Stars sprawled across the sky, not like distant worlds, but close companions. The fire crackled its lullaby, and for a few hours, wrapped in wool, leather, and the stubbornness of survival, sleep arrived. Even if it showed up late and tracked mud into the tent, tomorrow would bring sun again. Perhaps not warmth, but the daily parade of predicaments and plans. But first, a short shivering pause beneath the celestial dome, and maybe, just maybe, a snore or two, unless the boots started rustling. And just beyond the ridge, beneath another handful of stars, someone else was preparing for a colder kind of journey. Somewhere between the crackle of a dying campfire and the hush of prairie wind, the frontier's truest challenge came tiptoeing in, not outlaws or rattlesnakes, but something colder, quieter, and far more patient. Nighttime in the Old West wasn't merely dark. It was a velvet trap of frost and silence. And while cowboys had many adaptations to deal with bandits, bar brawls, and being trampled by their own horses, none of that training helped much when the temperature dipped to, "Your mustache is now an icicle." Travelers crossing the plains soon learned, often the shivery way, that winter nights in the American frontier weren't just inconvenient. They were unforgiving. Stars sparkled like judgmental diamonds above, and you could practically hear the moon whisper, "Should have brought a thicker blanket, partner." There was a method to the madness of Western survival, though, and like everything else out here, it came with a certain dusty charm. When a cold front rolled in, long before the Weather Channel could give alarming updates in a soothing tone, folks tracked cold by how loud their boots echoed in empty town streets, or how fast smoke curled from their neighbors' chimneys. Clothing was the first line of defense, but forget Gore-Tex and windproof zippers. The frontier was all about wool, layers, and more wool. If it itched, it worked. Men and women alike wrapped themselves in long underwear stitched by grandmothers with more opinions than thread, flannel shirts that could double as horse blankets, and buffalo hide coats that still smelled faintly of judgmental bison. Even the mighty Stetson hat, icon of the Wild West, did more than keep sun out of your eyes. It doubled as a windshield, water dish, fly swatter, and, in more than a few desperate cases, a mitten, or pillow, or moral support. Now, when it came to sleeping outside in wintertime, lone travelers had to get creative. The wise ones carried thick buffalo robes or bearskin blankets. If they were rich, fancy, or loosely acquainted with a bear, others relied on bedrolls so tightly bound they could make a burrito jealous. They would dig shallow, rests in the ground, line them with dry grass or pine needles, then sandwich themselves like a human lasagna between layers of fur, wool, and poor decisions. Campfires, while charming and toasty, came with downsides. Smoke attracted attention from both nosy possums and less cuddly night creatures. Fire also gave away positions to less than friendly types who might be interested in borrowing your horse indefinitely. So many travelers learned the ancient art of the banked fire, building it under a layer of soil and ash so it glowed warm and stealthy, like a secret they shared with the earth. But sometimes, despite your best intentions and all the itchy wool money could buy, the cold came barging in anyway. And when it did, cowboys had one last trick: body heat. Yes, The same surly creature who just spent 6 hours insulting your mustache might be your nighttime cuddle buddy if temperatures drop too low. This was called elbow room by optimists and desperate human, burritoing by everyone else. There were also tricks learned from indigenous nations, who had of course been surviving winters out here for generations before wagon wheels ever audibly squeaked onto the plains. Native tribes used ingenious clothing layers, constructed insulated dwellings, and positioned their camps near windbreaks and thermal zones. Untaught wisdom the newcomers slowly, stubbornly borrowed after many frostbitten toes. Some frontier women struck upon clever solutions all their own. Heated stones wrapped in fabric made for warm sleeping companions without complaints. Hot brick in a tin pail, makeshift foot warmer, house cats, nature's judgmental hot water bottles. And yes, before the age of microwaves and those sachets of oatmeal sorcery, pioneers were heating up rocks and calling it innovation. Even with all these sensible, or questionably sensible methods, many nights were merely endured. Frost clung to the insides of tent walls like ghostly lace. Breath fogged in the darkness, swirling above slumbering travelers like steam above soup. And any time you had to leave the tent midnight for nature's less than polite urgencies, you returned faster than a jackrabbit, late for its own dinner. Yet, against that deep and wandering cold, camaraderie often became the warmest fuel. Laughter under itchy blankets, strange and meandering stories shared among the embers, and the sturdy hope that maybe tomorrow the wind might be gentler or the coffee stronger. And so, as the frost stretched across the prairie in long silver fingers, one snoring cowboy turned in his sleep, pulling his blanket closer. Not from fear, not from discomfort, but because in the Wild West, snuggling with survival had become something of a nightly ritual. In the distance, a coyote yawned eloquently. But come daylight, what would truly thaw frozen spirits? Perhaps the promise of breakfast beans and a fire that didn't need convincing to stay lit. As the pale moon bobbed quietly above the frost-laced roofs of frontier cabins, the rules of human survival tucked themselves in beside any soul brave or foolish enough to sleep outside. In the Old West, nighttime wasn't charming. It didn't arrive with lantern-lit strolls or the gentle chirping of crickets beside a babbling brook. No, nighttime arrived like a debt collector, with frostbitten knuckles and a bone-pure grudge. You see, daybreak might have belonged to the cattle drivers and the gold diggers, but nightfall belonged to cold. Real cold. Not a put on another jacket cold, but if you don't hug this goat you'll die kind of cold. Speaking of goats and other grudging companions, survival, particularly after sundown, was less about bravery and more about bedding. In some parts of Montana, a well-insulated blanket was more valuable than a rifle. And if yours was stuffed with buffalo hair instead of feathers, congratulations, you had a practical fortune and a 30% higher chance of waking up with all your toes. Now, of course, homesteaders did their darndest to tame the elements. They'd chink their log cabins with homemade mortar, usually a blend of mud, moss, and optimism, hoping it kept the wind out. But sometimes, the icy air laughed its way right through the cracks, setting up camp somewhere near your kneecaps just as you were drifting off. Even the most seasoned cowboys, hardened by thousands of sun-baked days, admitted the prairie night was no friend. Trails would vanish under moonlit snow, making it far too easy to step ankle-deep into an icy puddle cleverly disguised as solid ground. And remember, this was an era before waterproof boots, so that was less oops and more farewell left foot. Many adopted a tried-and-true mantra known by survivalists and toddlers alike, sleep in a heap. Sure, rugged individualism sounded mighty good in the daylight hours, but when the temperatures plummeted, cowhands and trappers alike resorted to popular snuggling, though nobody ever said it quite that way. A dozen strong-backed men would bunk up in a sod house no larger than your average broom closet, wrapped in damp lariats and smells that defy proper scientific description. If you've ever wanted to truly understand camaraderie, try spooning a stranger while a raccoon scrapes at the window and someone near the stove whispers, "I think the chimney's frozen." But adversity breeds creativity or desperation, and the folks of the frontier crafted some ingenious methods to stay warm. One popular solution was the brick trick. Heat a brick in the fire and wrap it in cloth before tucking it into bed with you. A pioneer's version of an electric blanket, just without the electricity, or the blanket, or the safety standards. In more desperate hours, folks used heated potatoes. That's right, those same starchy wonders meant for dinner ended up in bed. They'd curl up next to you like a root vegetable tabby cat, slowly releasing heat through unfortunate smells that your sinuses would remember forever. Even more rustic methods came courtesy of livestock. Calves and dogs were welcome bedfellows, while goats presented more of a shouting match. Chickens, though, were generally discouraged, unless you didn't mind waking up to a hen laying eggs in your hat. Then, of course, there were those who slept outdoors out of necessity. Trappers, scouts, or unfortunate souls caught midway between nowhere and further nowhere. They learned to build frost shelters from snow, fashioning igloo-like structures, or digging down to the earth beneath the snowpack, where warmth gathered like a secret held in nature's quiet heart. And let's not forget buffalo robes, the luxury item of the West, outside of actual working teeth. A thick buffalo hide could keep a person toasty, even in sub-zero winds, provided they didn't mind smelling like the prairie's most opinionated animal. Still, wrapped up tight, you could survive the blackest nights, with only the occasional visitor, like a coyote or an ambitious skunk, to keep things interesting. Some swore by spiritual protection, leaving offerings or saying particular prayers before bed, just in case Old Man Winter was listening. He usually wasn't, but it helped some folks sleep better, and that counted for something. So the night fell hard, but folks, in their quietly stubborn way, always found ways to push back against it, with hot potatoes, goat cuddles, or a brick gently steaming at their feet. And somewhere, just down the frozen trail, the wind was beginning to whisper the name of another secret, one that had nothing to do with warmth, but everything to do with watching the dark. The wind had a personality of its own out on the prairie. It didn't howl. Howling would be too purposeful. No, it hummed and meandered like a bored ghost, too lazy to rattle chains, just brushing against canvas tents, stirring the odd tumbleweed, aloofly, like a cat batting at something it's not entirely interested in. It was these kinds of nights, open, moody skies, and a horizon that stretched like taffy, that made sleep both a necessity and an elaborate strategy. You see, surviving the cold in the Wild West wasn't simply about piling on hides and muttering prayers into your bedroll. It was about becoming part scientist, part gambler, and, crucially, a deft negotiator with your own bladder. Beds, if you could call them that, came in layers: an animal hide if you were lucky, saddle blankets if you weren't, and your own body heat doing all the heavy lifting. The average cowboy traveled with a bedroll lovingly nicknamed the Sugan, a word of uncertain spelling and even more uncertain cleanliness. It was part sleeping bag, part portable coffin, lined with wool, canvas, and dirt from 3 different counties. At night, a man would roll himself into his sugan like a burrito with trust issues and hope that nothing with teeth found the arrangement too tempting. Because beneath the icy stars and beyond the creaking of the sagebrush, real threats crept on silent paws. Coyotes were constant background chatter, but bobcats were quiet opportunists. Mountain lions were the real drama queens of the western night. And then there were the humans, drifters, rustlers, and the occasional traveler who'd gone a little sideways after too many nights staring into flame, while beans overcooked by inches. Ah yes, the beans. One of the great culinary conveniences of camp life, and an equally great nocturnal hazard. Shoveling down a heap of pork and beans right before crawling into a tightly wrapped canvas cocoon had consequences, particularly for those sharing close quarters. And therein lies one of the more unspoken but deeply understood survival skills of the West. Choosing your sleeping companions wisely, not by trustworthiness or conversational charm, but by gastrointestinal restraint. Fires provided warmth, of course, but Sparky the Flame, as I've now decided to name him, had to be tended with care. Too big, and you'd draw attention. Too small, and you'd wake up mildly frozen and angrily disappointed. And regardless of size, the fire needed a watchman, which led to one of the West's oldest and most dreaded traditions, taking turns riding the misery of the midnight fire shift. Rotating fire duty meant dragging your weary limbs out of a semi-warm bedroll in the dead of night, only to sit like a carved turnip for 2 hours, tossing twigs into embers and trying not to drift off and set the prairie ablaze. They say nothing builds character like hardship, but rotating fire duty is what built cowboys' 1,000-yard stares. Some nights, though, the cold settled in like a sermon, long, inescapable, and full of regret. In these moments, ingenuity unfurled alongside hypothermia. Folks slept in a circle, backs toward the center, in what one might call an early version of the radiator convention. If radiators had dirt under their fingernails and a tendency to snore, those with horses slept near them, half for warmth, half for comfort, and partly because if your horse wandered off at night, you'd greet dawn with the terrifying realization that you'd replaced rider with walker in your job description. No one wanted that. And then there was the moon, that lonesome silver cousin to the sun, casting its chilly glow across the plains like it was judging everyone's life choices, but too polite to say anything. Cowboys, nomads, trappers, all at some point found themselves talking to it, sometimes sober, usually not. The night in the West was rarely quiet, but instead full of the kind of sounds that gather in your bones. Footsteps on dry brush, the spluttering song of someone dreaming badly, the reluctant creak of old leather. And amid it all, under the big sky and against the curtain of stars, sleep came not as a gift, but as a surrender, a mild truce made with the cold, with fear, and with one's own aching joints. As the wind finally settled and the fire crackled into soft embers, the land exhaled, and far off, the distant yip of a coyote reminded anyone still awake that tomorrow was waiting, unforgiving, dust-covered, and already laughing at your frozen boots. But then again, there just might be a trick or two to help you warm them up. In the undulating emptiness of the American West, where wind seemed to have a secret grudge against shelter, the prairie night was no place for the unprepared or the overdressed. One of the lesser-known truths from frontier survival lore, that being bundled like a Christmas ham in wool and flannel could, paradoxically, make you colder. This delightfully counterintuitive detail was not lost on the more observant pioneers. Experienced cowhands had a phrase for it. Sweat is a liar in January. You start warm, you move, you sweat. And when night drops its icy curtain, that sweat turns your clothes into frosty betrayal. It's nature's version of a bait and switch, only it doesn't apologize or offer store credit. So how did they do it? How did these frostbitten night dwellers make it to morning without turning to chisel statues? The answer lies in a combination of grit, wool, and a marvelous little thing called the buffalo robe. To the unacquainted, a buffalo robe might sound like frontier spa attire, but it was no fashion statement. It was, quite literally, a flattened bison hide, tanned and softened just enough to wrap around you without scraping off your elbows. The thick, still fuzzy hides were a kind of pre-modern all-weather sleeping bag made from America's most generous shag carpet. In the biting darkness, pioneers would swaddle themselves in these robes like very serious, somewhat grumpy caterpillars, waiting for warmth or eventual chrysalis. Buffalo robes, it turns out, were coveted items, often handed down, traded or shared depending on how many people were trying to survive the night and how many trust issues they had with their traveling companions. On cold cattle drives, chuck wagon crews slept two to a robe, not from affection, but from necessity. Romance was rare. Shivering was universal. Now, for those lacking access to a buffalo or the inclination to wrestle one for its fuzzy jacket, there were other methods. Dirt, for example. We don't talk enough about dirt. In the absence of trees, canvas, or logic, many frontiersmen dug shallow pits and slept in them, like particularly ornery moles. Half buried, wrapped in whatever blankets or rags they had, they used the earth's insulation to fend off frost. And while this wasn't exactly five-star accommodation, it was, by prairie standards, absurdly cozy. Then there were fires, glorious crackling monuments to not freezing to death. But a fire on the open plains, especially during a gusty western night, came with certain difficulties. Sparks were free, spirits. Wind was moody and had a well-documented feud with tents, and maintaining a fire all night meant staying awake, which somewhat defeated the idea of resting. Enter the cowboy stove. Not a stove in the traditional sense, but a pair of burning logs stuffed into a shallow trench, wind-blocked and slowly feeding warmth into the ground and toward shivering feet. Ingenious, dangerous, slightly smelly, but effective in keeping toes from transforming into tiny, fleshy snow cones. Of course, not all danger came from cold alone. Coyotes, bugs the size of coasters, and that one cow with unsettling eye contact. These were part of the nighttime ambience, but it was the silence that really got to you. Deep silence. Smothering, cotton-thick silence. The kind that made you suddenly aware of how loud your thoughts could be when bouncing around inside a cold skull. Yet in that quiet, with the stars burned into the velvet sky above, and the prairie stretching out like the world's largest, sleepiest quilt, there was beauty. Surreal, bone-deep beauty. The kind that hurts a little, like icy air in your lungs, or a historical fact you somehow missed all of grade school. And though tales of frostbite, rattlesnakes, and wind-induced madness tend to steal the limelight, the ordinary triumph of simply surviving the night in that relentless landscape deserves applause. Or, at the very least, a soft, knowing nod. Because when your pillow is a saddle, and your blanket still smells vaguely like buffalo breath, comfort is a complex negotiation. As dawn crept up in pale streaks of gold and pink behind the horizon, those bleary-eyed travelers would rise, shake off the cold like bad dreams, and begin another day of dust, beans, and trying not to fall asleep while riding. And somewhere out there on the windswept plains, a new invention, small, strange, and oddly optimistic, was starting to make its way into Western camps, the humble bedroll. But that too has a story all its own. Snow, in the frontier imagination, held a peculiar charm, until it soaked through your boots and froze your bacon grease solid by breakfast. As winter wrapped its icy arms around the Great Plains and Rocky Mountain outposts, the cowboys' bravado often gave way to a more pressing concern: survival, with toes intact if possible. Nights on the prairie in late December were less peaceful blankets of snow, and more howling existential crisis dressed as a windstorm. The blizzard didn't politely knock. It kicked the saloon door clean off its hinges, bellowing through the cracks in every cabin wall and punishing any nostril daring enough to peek outside. Cold was not the enemy you stabbed or shot. It was the one you had to outwit. It slithered silently under coats, nipped at fingers during midnight horse checks, and insinuated itself into your very bones. The cowboys and drifters of the West weren't necessarily chasing adventure. They were outrunning frostbite, one coffee-scented campfire at a time. Blankets were layered like diplomatic treaties, with buffalo robes prized for their thick, musky warmth. If you were lucky enough to have a dog, an honest one, not one of those slippery-eyed cattle thieves disguised in fur, it curled beside you at night, adding a humble handful of degrees to your sleeping arrangements. If you had a friend, now that was luxury. Two humans under one tarp meant you were either close companions or simply too cold to care about the awkwardness of knee-to-knee proximity. Stoves, if present in cabins or outposts, required constant feeding. Wood had to be chopped and stacked with the foresight of a prairie groundhog who'd taken up accounting. And yet, those lucky enough to own a cast-iron stove were envied by the more nomadic wolves among the West population, trappers, cowhands, and gamblers, all of whom had felt the peculiar dismay of waking to find their boots frozen solid, standing at attention like unfortunate leather soldiers. Even the trail food turned adversarial. Beans stiffened like bricks. Hardtack became truly hard, and black coffee chilled into a sludgy memory before you could raise it fully to your lips. Whiskey, which might have offered false warmth for an hour, could betray you entirely by freezing mid-pour. Imagine, if you will, the quiet heartbreak of spooning your bourbon. But no villain of the cold was quite as legendary, or potentially deadly, as night itself. In the settled East, darkness was a gentle curtain. In the West, it was a beast with its own breath and bite. Men didn't just fear what they could see after dusk. They feared what crept closer under cover of moonlight. Rustlers, wolves, loneliness, and the endlessly patient cold. Many settlers learned the trick of sleeping in shifts, not just for defense, but because staying awake and tending the fire might mean the difference between waking up annoyed or not waking up at all. Some grew philosophical about it. The frost, after all, wasn't evil. It simply was. You could yell at it, curse it in 6 different languages and 2 made-up ones, but the wind would just keep on blowing, unbothered by your opinions. Frontier etiquette demanded certain arrangements. If you bunked in with strangers, say, at a way station or remote trading post, you kept your stories brief, your body heat communal, and your feet to yourself. Starting a fire required patience and kindling. Ending a conversation only needed the sentence, "Mind if I borrow your extra sock?" Even animals adapted to the weather in ways that bordered on the poetic. Horses turned their backs to the wind and pressed close to one another, breathing steam into the silence. Coyotes sung to each other as they threaded through the snow-blanketed scrub, and even the mule, cantankerous on sunniest days, mellowed into a sullen philosopher under the stars. Though the nights were long and brutally cold, they were also unspeakably beautiful. The skies opened up in dizzying constellations, as if someone had poked holes in the heavens just to let the starlight spill through. And for every frostbitten toe or lost mitten, there was a moment of stillness that reminded a traveler why they'd risked it all to be out here. Freedom, it seemed, wore long johns under its chaps. As the wind settled for the night and the last embers fizzled into shadows, snuggled deep into a nest of wool and stubbornness, the frontier sleeper may have whispered a quiet promise to the dawn. If the stove holds and the fire doesn't die, I'll make it to morning. And by the time the first bluish-grey shrug of dawn pressed against the horizon, that promise waited, cold but unbroken, for one more sleepy story by firelight. While many Western tales are built on duels at dawn or standoffs at high noon, far fewer speak of the heroic bedtime rituals required to not perish overnight, between the firewood, the rattlesnakes, and your horse's sudden decision to relocate to another county. The simple act of sleeping outdoors on the range could easily become an unplanned audition for ghosthood. Tonight brings us into the dim-lit world of campfire etiquette, particularly as practiced by cattle drivers and travelers just trying to sleep without waking up as something's chew toy. The fire itself was your closest friend, your most practical defense system, and, should you fail to manage it carefully, the Western equivalent of sleeping with a hand grenade. A cowboy might travel 60 miles in a day, herding hundreds of startled cows and avoiding unlicensed bullets. But come nighttime, the dash for warmth required equal dexterity. First, find dry kindling. This task might sound simple to us modern folk, who think the wilderness is a Wi-Fi dead zone. But remember, the Wild West didn't come equipped with instructional YouTube videos or an REI membership. In many parts of Nevada or Wyoming, one might find as much dry wood as musical theatre fans, which is to say, not many at all. And so, you scrape together some burr sage, perhaps an unlucky chunk of juniper. Others might settle for cow chips, not a snack, mind you, but desiccated cow dung. Yes, the American frontier truly mastered the art of burning one's problems. With a sputtering fire coaxed into being, the next question became, where to sleep? Ideally, not directly on the ground, unless you were hoping to wake up stiff as a commemorative statue. In some cases, cowboys slept on their saddles, provided they didn't mind being gently poked by leather and rivets for 8 hours. For bedding, there was the famous bedroll, a canvas burrito filled with wool blankets, spare socks, and at least 3 varieties of dust. It was not uncommon for a fellow to sleep wrapped inside such a roll like a tightly packed human tamale. The trick was to use just enough blanket so you didn't freeze, but not so much that you woke up sweating your body weight and attracting all the desert insects with dreams of salt. A curious rider by night might stumble upon a camp with quiet figures nestled around an almost polite fire, murmurs of songs soft against the wind. These weren't full-throated renditions of frontier ballads. No, these were sleep-seeking hums, half-remembered tunes about missing towns, or elusive women known only as Rosie, or the one who took the mule. To guard against nocturnal calamities, many camps used the sleep rotation. One soul, usually the newest or most guilt-ridden for some ill-fated joke involving beans, would stand the first watch. Their job was to patrol quietly, rifle strapped, eyes peeled. Not for bandits, who were too tired for nighttime shenanigans, but for wolves, bears, or that one steer named Rufus, who hadn't been seen since lunch and was now likely planning a hostile takeover. Insults were rarely shouted at night. Boredom, however, roamed freely. The night guard might spend his lonely hours whittling small objects like spoons or mustaches for squirrels. Others practiced the noble art of staring into the darkness while contemplating whether tumbleweeds had feelings. As for crime, yes, it did lurk, but even outlaws had bedtimes, and they often preferred to rob in daylight when it was easier to tell whom you were robbing. Midnight theft was not unheard of, but stealing a horse in pitch-black conditions was a fast way to attempt tripping into 4 hooves and getting politely stomped into a learning experience. Coyotes called from distant hills, their cries part warning, part lullaby. The crackle of the fire waned as the embers took on that low red-eyed glow, like they too were getting drowsy. Somewhere, a harmonica whispered a sleepy note, and beneath the dome of stars, dozens of bedrolls rose in subtle snoring hills. All was, for the moment, warm enough, quiet enough, and just this side of dangerous. And as the moon slid westward, the fire now only a sliver of its former self, the sleeping cowboys and wanderers began to dream of daylight and breakfast. But the west had one more nightly visitor waiting in its dark wings, the wind, and that shivering twist of nature. Well, it arrives with mischief in chapter 17. In the flickering hush of night, somewhere between the creak of an old saddle and the sigh of a coyote on the wind, the true art of Western survival came down to one essential truth. Warmth was more important than pride. And nowhere was this more evident than in the curious case of frontier fashion. Now, imagine the scene. A rough-hewn cowboy layered in moth-eaten long johns, a questionable raccoon hat with eyes still intact, and, just when you thought the ensemble couldn't peak, an apron from Miss Lottie's abandoned pie shop draped over his shoulders for insulation. Survival mode had no patience for vanity. Despite popular myths of dusty heroes riding into the sunset in perfect tailoring, the Wild West was far more flannel than finesse. Cotton was cozy, wool was gold, and fur. Fur was the currency of not freezing to death. In fact, men once brawled over a single pair of buffalo hide moccasins. The loser, rumor has it, walked barefoot for 3 days and became a poet out of spite, or frostbite. Accounts vary. Blankets were treated like treasure. A single Hudson's Bay point blanket, those heavy woolen rectangles marked with cryptic black stripes, was worth its weight in warmth. Sleeping under one wasn't just comfortable, it could be the difference between waking up or being woken up by a grizzly mistaking you for a frozen snack. But outerwear alone wasn't enough for the cold. No, folk got creative. They lined their coats with rabbit pelts, stuffed their boots with dried moss, and bundled themselves like war-weary onions. And still, even with layers enough to impress a Russian doll, a man could look upon a howling blizzard and whisper, "We're all going to die, aren't we?" Then he'd throw another pine log on the fire and roast his boots to keep hope alive. Ah yes, the fire, the glowing, crackling, hypnotic heart of any cold camp. A good fire could heat bodies, cook beans, toast hardtack, and keep the dark beasts of night at bay. A better fire inspired stories. And the best fire, the one you didn't accidentally sleep too close to, lest you wake up with melted saddle wax and one less eyebrow. Cooking by fire in the cold was a performance in itself. Picture an old scout slowly stirring a cast iron pot, snowflakes gathering on his hat, while he murmurs to himself like a sage, This here chili's got 2 kinds of beans and 3 kinds of regret. Despite the lack of spices, the cold turns hunger into seasoning. Even a meal of salted fatback and burnt cornbread becomes a feast if eaten beside a warm blaze with all 10 fingers still functioning. Then there were the shelters. Some preferred digging into the snow itself, a tactic known as a snow trench, which sounds charming until you realize it's basically a frozen coffin with hope. Others slept against felled logs or inside hollow trees. The cleverest would rig a lean-to with canvas and pine boughs, facing it just right to reflect the fire's heat, without inviting the smoke to slowly sear their nostrils all night long. And if one was properly lucky, or more likely, unlucky, they might spend a night in what locals called a dugout, a cave-like dwelling dug into a hillside. While delightfully warm, they occasionally came with a roommate in the form of a hibernating badger or extremely territorial marmot. Lodging disputes with these creatures never went in the human's favor. It didn't help that the cold did strange things to the mind. People claimed to have long conversations with icicles, misidentified frozen horse pies as gold nuggets, and once, in the case of an old trapper named Gus, serenaded what he later admitted might have been a snowman. Still, every frozen night survived gave rise to morning legends. The West may have been unkind, but it rewarded stubbornness. And as the fire embers dimmed and frosted breath rose into the tent rafters of a makeshift shelter, the soul of the frontier stirred. Somewhere out there, wrapped in hide and humor, the next cold challenge waited. But for now, there was warmth, moonlight, and the knowledge that no matter how wild the weather, the wild inside a determined heart was warmer still. Beneath the stars, where the wolves howled like flute players with poor technique, something softer stirred, a mystery not of blankets or boots, but of the places one hid when the wind grew teeth. A quiet place will follow next time, when the shadows call us inward once more. As evening's lavender hush descended over the high plains, the wild western wind decided to share a few secrets of its own, mostly about how rude it could be when temperatures dropped, faster than a rattlesnake bite at a card table. There, in the middle of the sagebrush sea, men bundled tighter into their coats, while women stoked fires with the kind of intensity usually reserved for brawls and pie-baking contests. The cold wasn't just inconvenient. It was a sly, bone-thieving outlaw that bullied its way into tent flaps and under shirt collars with the quiet confidence of a gambler who only plays aces. Getting through the western night wasn't simply about keeping warm. It was about not freezing into a cautionary tale for the next wagon train. The West had a peculiar way of testing your resilience, especially when the stars came out to criticize your layering choices. Nights could drop to 20 below, sometimes lower in the mountain plateaus. And unless you were the sort who relished hypothermia as a spiritual experience, you learned fast, and often the hard way, that survival didn't come from bravado. It came from blankets, beans, and knowing when to shut the tent flap before midnight frost took liberties with your toenails. Buffalo robes became prized possessions, not just for warmth, but because falling asleep wrapped in 30 pounds of hide somehow felt like being hugged by a prehistoric rug that never judged your snoring. They were soft, dense, and surprisingly effective at dulling the cold's bite. It's said a good buffalo robe could outmatch 3 layers of wool and 1 sloppily sworn oath against winter in the same breath. Trappers, scouts, and cowpokes swore by them, and occasionally adds them, when the smell refused to wash out. The campfire, though romanticized in dime novels and dusty paintings, was a fickle friend. It radiated just enough heat to make you believe you were safe, and then promptly encouraged smoke to chase you no matter which way you turned. Sleep near it, and you risked cinders burning through your saddlebags or your mustache. Sleep away from it, and you'd wake with eyelids frozen shut if the wind changed its mind. A truly Western campfire was less a heat source and more a wild-eyed house guest, occasionally useful, often dramatic, and prone to starting uninvited things. So ingenuity was the real survival tool. Cowboys learned to dig shallow hollows in the earth, what they called cowboy beds, barely more than foot-deep pits lined with canvas or brush. In you'd go, wrapped in whatever coats, quilts, or fellow mammals you could convince to join you. Above, the stars would shimmer with the smugness of celestial beings who never had to find dry firewood in January. One ingenious trick came from the native tribes, who had mastered winter long before boots had spurs. They'd heat rocks in the fire, wrap them in hides or cloth, and tuck them into sleeping areas. A makeshift hot water bottle without the water. Cowboys, never ones to let a good idea pass without imitation or exaggeration, took to hauling around smooth river rocks in their saddlebags, hoping to warm them up just before bedding down. Of course, success varied. Heated too long, and the rock simply roasted your thigh. Not long enough, and it exuded as much warmth as a polite rejection letter. But every now and then, you'd find a cowboy contentedly hugging his volcanic boulder like it was the last tender thing in New Mexico. Then, there was the matter of socks, frequently absent, occasionally mismatched, and always the first thing to disappear in a midnight theft. Wool socks were so treasured that some even slept with them under their hats to keep them safe and warm, making every morning a bit of a foot-smelling compromise. As the night deepened and wind slipped between the cottonwoods with the glee of a gossip, most folks didn't sleep so much as doze in survival increments. A minute here, a few heartbeats there. The full embrace of sleep was a luxury more common in towns or dreams. But here, in the frontier quiet, where frost crept like a slow ghost and coyotes harmonized under star blankets, there was a strange beauty to the danger, a poetry in the stillness. You'd wake in the dark, watch your breath ghost up into the brisk ceiling of sky, and realize that even the harshest nights held their own kind of calm. A deadly calm, sure, but peaceful, in the way only a place untouched by clocks and comfort could be. And somewhere out there, as wind whispered through the brittle scrub, came the soft rustle of something even colder, and much, much hungrier. But that tale, well, we'll leave that for the next firelit hour. They say the wind in Wyoming could peel a man like a potato, and folks in the frontier towns didn't take kindly to peeling, which is why, by the time dusk rolled around and the horizon dipped behind those cold, craggy hills, even the roughest cowpoke looked for a corner of warmth to call his own. Now, I'd like to introduce you to the unsung hero of survival in the American West, buffalo chips. Yes, the mighty pan-flattened patties of bison excrement. When the prairie gave you vast emptiness and not a tree for miles, it gave you buffalo chips instead. Dried in the sun and practically scentless when burned, a small mercy from the plains gods. These humble cow pies became the ultimate campfire fuel. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for travelers to collect them carefully along their journey, treating every lucky find like nuggets of gold. Extremely brown, flat, and definitely not gold. Out in these wide, wind-haunted landscapes, heat wasn't a luxury. It was the dividing line between survival and becoming a very cold cautionary tale. And so, settlers became experts in the art of improvising warmth. Wool, for instance. Blessed scratchy wool. Wool underwear, wool blankets, wool mittens, wool everything short of wool soup. Occasionally, a fur trapper might line his coat with raccoon pelts, or even fashion boots from skunk hides. It kept him warm, but came with startling social consequences. Then there was the cozy but crude technique of sleeping 2 or 3 to a bed, regardless of complaints about snoring or poking elbows. Cowboys, known for their rugged independence, were not immune. On especially frigid nights, you'd find 2 hardened trail companions huddled under a buffalo robe, pretending not to notice each other for dignity's sake. It became the West's most stoic love story. Man meets man, shares body heat, never speaks of it again. And of course, there were the cabins, more drafty than cozy, often built with optimism more than insulation. Chinking, that sticky mortar between logs, was supposed to keep out the icy breath of winter. In reality, it did a better job keeping out the neighbor's opinion than actual weather. So they hung oilcloth, stuffed moss, or repurposed just about anything to stop the breeze that was seemingly determined to redecorate their interiors in snowflakes and regret. At nightfall, the hearth became the heart. People gathered near the flames telling stories partly for comfort, partly to stay awake until the embers died. There weren't many lullabies on the range, but there were folk tunes, fiddle songs, and the occasional whispered tale that might have involved stolen horses, narrow escapes, and someone's brother who saw a ghost just west of Cheyenne. Even the animals had their cold weather rituals. Horses were often blanketed with old quilts, and barn dogs routinely claimed the best corners near the fire. Chickens, those fluffed-up feathered huddlers, sometimes found their way inside where they'd roost indignantly atop kitchen shelves, emitting the occasional sleepy cluck as if to say, "We don't like this either." It's worth noting, with a gentle chuckle, that despite all these rough conditions, the human instinct to make things cozy never quite died. A homesteader's cabin might be filled with handmade quilts, carved rocking chairs, and even a tender portrait or painted plate from back east. The desire for comfort, for the illusion of gentleness amid the wild, is as old as the hills themselves. And so, the night rolled in again over the plains. The lantern was lit but low, casting warm shadows across the warped wooden walls. A baby sighed in its cradle. A man stirred the fire with a poker that had seen better days. And outside, the coyotes yipped at the moon like it owed them money. Inside that fragile warmth, faces relaxed. Eyes grew heavy. People dreamed of spring's return, or at least a morning when their socks didn't freeze upright. In the cold wild, where the stars blinked over 100 miles of nothing, sleep was a victory. But first, one had to earn it with embers and ingenuity. Now, if you're still restless, gently lie back and remember, the true Western hero wasn't always the gunslinger or the marshal. It was the soul who knew how to stack buffalo chips just right, start a fire during a windstorm, and keep the frost off their beard until daylight. We'll quietly follow them just a bit further down the trail, where the wind whispering through the canyon carries more than just cold. It carries the next part of the story. As dusk draped its long mauve shawl across the horizon, and the stars tumbled out like silver marbles from a velvet pouch, there was a particular worry chewing at the nerves of every soul braving the American frontier. Wolves, not just the four-legged, toothsome kind, but also the two-legged sort who smiled too much, smelled faintly of whiskey, and were very sudden with revolvers. But tonight, our tale takes special note of those sprightly, sharp-toothed night prowlers from the animal kingdom. because cold nights on the prairie may have been filled with silence, but they were rarely quiet. Wolves, canis lupus to any scholarly coyotes listening in, had a surprisingly well-earned reputation in the Old West, not just as hunters of stray calves and unwise chickens, but as prolific background noise. They were the sopranos of the nighttime choir, performing under the moonlight for an audience of snow-dusted hills and sleepless cowboys. Their howls could carry for miles across the wide open land, nestling into ears like ghost stories riding on chilly air. Now, settlers tried all manner of mischief to avoid becoming an evening snack. For starters, one never camped too close to a watering hole. That was like checking into a predator buffet. You might as well sit there with ketchup on your shirt. Instead, clever travelers nestled into dry ravines or beneath the shelter of thick brush, building fires only when absolutely necessary. And even then, they kept them low and quiet. Fire was warmth, yes, but also advertisement. Come one, come all. Cowboy flambe on tonight's menu. Then there was the time-honored practice of the night watch, drawing straws or playing a glum hand of cards to decide who'd remain awake while the others burrowed into their bedrolls like chilled armadillos. Many journals from the 1800s describe these solitary shifts with equal parts dread and boredom, staring into the dark, listening for the snap of a twig, or worse, the jingle of spurs not their own. Fortune favored the cautious and, oddly enough, the smelly. You see, some travelers discovered that rubbing themselves with stronger odors, grease, ash, or pungent tobacco could confuse or dissuade certain wild animals. This, of course, meant being both alive and largely avoided by one's peers. The stink method worked wonders against wolves, and less so in matters of courtship or dinner invites. And yet, despite all the deterrence and precautions, sometimes the wolves came in anyway. Curious, glowing-eyed shapes loping through the snow like ink dripped into cream. Most simply watched. A few got closer. And it goes without saying that horses did not care for that one little bit. A nervous horse in the dead of night behaved like a mother-in-law at a shotgun wedding. Jumpy, loud, and inclined to bolt, which is why many nights found travelers sleeping with one boot on and a hand on the saddle, just in case tomorrow arrived early and in a full gallop. Wolves, for their part, were rarely there to stage an ambush. These weren't storybook beasts nor nightmare-chiseled villains. They were creatures of hunger and habit, led by the moon and the worst parts of winter. What they really feared were guns, fire, and organized humans, and perhaps, deep down, accordion music. Though historical sources on that last point are tragically thin. There's a little-known tale from Dakota Territory about a trapper named Elmer Fonk, whose method of fending off wolves deserves a footnote in all survival manuals, if only for entertainment. Elmer, lacking bullets but rich in stubbornness, spent 3 long nights repelling wolves by reading aloud from a weather-beaten copy of Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. He claimed the wolves stayed at a respectful distance, clearly enjoying the monologues, but unwilling to cross paths with a man so unhinged as to perform live theatre in 10 degrees. As for whether the performance was any good, the wolves took that secret with them. But of all the frontier's nighttime worries, it's the shared fire that served as the heart of survival. Crackling in the dark, keeping spirits high and beers just cold enough. Around it, stories were traded, boots dried, and fears soothed for just a little while. The flicker of flame reminded lonely wanderers that even under starlit danger, there remained warmth, companionship, and just enough courage to last until dawn. And with the fire still breathing low and the horses finally settling after yet another canine chorus, the world tipped slowly into sleep once more, while something far larger than a wolf began to rise in the east, snorting steam and carrying secrets on steel rails. But that's a tale for another quiet night, somewhere between the coyote's yowl and the snapping hush of a frozen twig beneath a boot. Night on the frontier sharpened its quieter edges. The sky stretched wide above, a velvet robe stitched with cold starlight. A few pale clouds drifted like forgotten shawls across the moon's shoulders. And down below, life became a game of heat management and unreasonable optimism. By the 1880s, nightfall wasn't just the warm-up act to another day. It was something to be outmaneuvered, politely bribed, or endured with the stubborn grace of an old mule named after General Grant. Out in the wild, where trees huddled close and wolves talked in low murmurs, warmth wasn't just comfort, it was strategy. Frontier folk, being the insomniac engineers of necessity that they were, came up with inventive ways to cheat the cold. Take, for instance, the age-old method of heating stones in a fire, then wrapping them in cloth and tucking them into bedrolls. Effective, but risky. Too hot, and you'd scorch your backside. Too cool, and you'd just be cuddling a sullen rock. It was the West version of Goldilocks, except with fewer bears and more third-degree burns. One particularly endearing remedy involved spooning, mostly with humans, occasionally with dogs, and rarely, in desperate moments, with a suspiciously friendly goat. Cowboys called it a cowboy sandwich. 2 men, 1 blanket, and exactly 0 mentions of it ever again. The code of honor under the stars was simple. Don't die, don't talk about the sandwich, and try not to snore into your partner's ear. Now, if any poor sap found himself without fire, goat, or compatible cowboy, he might try sleeping in a standing position. And yes, that's not a joke. Leaning against a tree or huddling against the lee side of a wagon wheel was sometimes all that stood between a man and waking up as tomorrow's cautionary tale. Wrapping oneself in one's saddle blanket, clutching coffee grounds like they were talismans against hypothermia. That was just Tuesday. For those particularly fortunate or suspiciously lucky, there were sod dugouts. These charming half-underground homes looked like hobbit holes after a long winter bender. Damp, cramped, and occasionally home to a wayward snake. Still, they held heat better than tents or lean-tos, and the walls didn't flap when the wind howled like it was negotiating. One early settler in Nebraska built his entire home out of buffalo dung bricks, crowing proudly that it held together better than politics. Fires were lit in stone hearths, meals were cooked with dried corn and dreams, and families would gather close, partly for warmth, mostly because that was the size of the room. Even the more seasoned cowboys, who claimed to prefer a life under stars with coyotes for company, secretly coveted a windbreak on especially brutal nights. Fires were built low and narrow to avoid drawing attention from wandering bandits, bears, or particularly persuasive preachers with pamphlets. And yet, despite the odds, many found beauty in those snow-bitten, flame-flickered nights. The way the stars cracked overhead like frozen porcelain, the scent of pine smoke mingling with worn leather and hot beans. It wasn't luxury, but it was life. And for the unreasonably resourceful, there was always buffalo robes. These thick, shaggy pelts were the equivalent of sleeping in a bear's embrace. If the bear in question had been tanned, stitched, and occasionally mistaken for a carpet, a good buffalo robe could mean the difference between shivering into eternity and snoring into tomorrow. The only real downside was the smell, which one 1870s Army scout described as, quote, wool socks that lost a custody battle. But ingenuity didn't stop at warmth. No, in the hush of the western night, humans turned survival into a kind of art. From heating beans in the coals of last night's fire to using whiskey as both antifreeze and lullaby, each trick brought neighborhoods, bunkhouses, and solitary wanderers a little closer to morning. And somewhere, perhaps under a makeshift tent stitched from oiled canvas and misplaced confidence, a young traveler stared up at the stars, counting the seconds until dawn. The silence wrapped around him like a blanket, alive with distant howls and the scratch of dry brush in the wind. Tomorrow would bring new fires, new frost, and perhaps, if luck permitted, a warm place to sleep without having to share it with something that growled, but tonight held one last secret and will whisper it close as the fire flickers gently lower. The wind that swept across the plains had long since carried off any traces of pride and perfume. In its wake, it left behind grit, cough-worthy dust, and the sort of cold that crept under bedrolls like an uninvited rattlesnake wearing an ice tuxedo. The American frontier at night had many dangers: bandits, coyotes, spectral cowboys, who may or may not have just been very lost and very drunk. But the cold was the real bandit. It stole sleep, warmth, and occasionally your last remaining pair of dry socks. Tonight, we find ourselves in the company of an old cattleman named Jebediah Button Soup Wallace, a nickname he earned after an incident involving a thin stew and accidentally boiling his only coat button. It clacked against his teeth like a dime store rattle, but he ate it anyway, couldn't waste protein. Jebediah was part of a cattle drive stretching across Wyoming territory, a place where the horizon kept running from you like a gossip with a secret. The crew had bedded down for the night, their fire little more than an ember-crusted whisper. Firewood was scarce, and the night sky stretched above like a dark canvas poked full of cold stars. To survive prairie nights, the cowboys relied on time-honored methods: layers of wool, clever use of sad-looking buffalo robes, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge how cold their toes actually were. Pride, it turns out, generates body heat. Buttons Soup Wallace had a system. He'd bury heated rocks under his sleeping roll, a practice borrowed from the native tribes and wise old women of the Rockies. The rocks were warmed in the fire until they hissed and glowed slightly. Then he'd wrap them in his saddle blanket and tuck them like hot potatoes beneath his sheepskin mattress. Bliss, unless, of course, one of them cracked unexpectedly and sang a fiery tune into your thigh. Frontier comfort was an inexact science. Then there was the coffee trick. A tin mug of black, treacle-thick cowboy coffee, sipped slowly, mouth curled above the rim like a philosopher. It didn't keep you warm for long, but it made you feel brave enough to act like it did. Coffee back then was boiled into oblivion, sometimes containing bits of bark, grit, or wildly unidentifiable floaters. No one asked questions. Asking questions led to answers, and in the Wild West, ignorance was not only bliss, it was often nutritional. And oh, the snugglers. Cowboys were rarely shy about the occasional blanket partner on bitter nights. Call it survival, call it camaraderie, or just call it not freezing stiff as a tin spittoon. Two men under one buffalo robe could generate enough shared heat to fuel the dreams of a small town. They never talked about it in the daylight, of course, preferring to grunt and stretch dramatically, as though nothing had transpired except aggressive lounging. Even the horses played their part. One trick involved bedding down near your mare, Though watch your feet, because horses of the American West had the oddest habit of shifting in the night just as your face hit REM sleep. Still, nothing quite matched the earthy aroma of a warm horse flank when the wind howled like a banshee with a cold. Despite all these creative efforts, sheepskins, shared heat, sizzling rocks, many still woke with facial hair crusted in frost and a nose so numb it could double as a compass needle. Yet, somehow, they made it. The passion for land, the hope of a better life, or perhaps just the stubbornness baked into their bones, kept them crawling forward. That night, Jebediah Wallace dreamt of a world where buffalo robes came in heated versions and tin coffee mugs magically refilled themselves, perhaps brought to him by a kindly, floating arm in a pair of warming gloves. He giggled in his sleep at the image, unaware that one of the burial rocks had singed a hole clean through the sock he'd mended with horsehair the week before. Ah well, by frontier standards, that was the height of luxury. The wind died down sometime just before dawn, lulled into slumber by prairie silence and the faint pop of embers. And as the wagons creaked softly in their sleep, and the stars turned their patient eyes toward the sleeping camp, a quiet gathered over the landscape. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yawned, and just beyond the edge of the ridge, where cold met courage, and dawn waited for its cue, the next chapter of resilience was about to begin. Midwinter on the frontier stirred a kind of quiet dread, the kind that crept in like a chill under the collar and didn't leave till spring. It was less a season and more a siege, and out where fences were scarce and neighbors scarcer. The cold didn't knock, it just came in, settled itself by the hearth, and reminded you that frostbite had no manners. But survival wasn't all stoic grit and furrowed brows. It was also equal parts creativity, stubbornness, and slightly suspicious recipes involving bear fat. Take, for instance, the curious tale of Hetty Two-Blanket Givens, a Missouri widow turned homesteader who famously survived an entire February by wrapping herself in quilts, bison hides, and what turned out to be a large tax ledger no one was using. They said she refused to let her chickens sleep indoors, claiming they gossip too much, even though it was a common solution in the worst cold spells. Chickens were portable, warm, and conversational, even if judgmental. In the absence of central heating, which wouldn't fancy walking across a prairie even if it existed, sleeping arrangements evolved into something more akin to strategic huddling. Families piled into bed together, creating what they earnestly referred to as the human furnace, and what modern plumbing would later call an unventilated situation. It was not uncommon to wake up beneath more weight in wool than livestock had worn alive. And oh, the nighttime rituals. Before retiring, one might warm a brick near the fire, place it at the foot of the bed, and pray one didn't forget which end was which in the dark. Ironstone pans filled with embers warmed boots and toes alike, so long as you didn't mind your boots permanently smelling like last night's ash biscuits. But not all solutions were practical. In the town of Broken Hat, Colorado, a local saloon keeper named Dennis decided to combat the deep freeze by inventing a whiskey coat, essentially a wool jacket soaked in hooch. It didn't repel the cold, but it made people stop caring and, regrettably, flammable. It was displayed once at the county fair before being banned at the behest of the mayor's eyebrows. The skies themselves contributed to the season's discomfort, casting nights in ice blue hues and pinpricks of stars. Out there, in that fragile silence, the old cowboys believed the wind could carry a man's thoughts for miles. That's why so many tied extra scarves over their mouths, partially for warmth, but also in case their thoughts included swearing at the cold a little too loudly. Communication across snowy distances was a problem unto itself. Most signal fires were buried in drifts before they could smoulder, so folks got creative. Telegraph wires were often the only line of contact, and some telegraph agents passed time by writing melancholic cowboy poetry in Morse code. Somewhere in Kansas, someone surely wept in dots and dashes. One mustn't forget the delicate art of sleeping with weapons. Outlaws, bless their unpredictable timing, loved a crisp winter night to raid a ranch or swipe a slumbering stagecoach's cargo. Thus, many a pioneer bedroll included either a revolver, a Bowie knife, or, if one was particularly paranoid, a polite but firm note asking bandits to wait until spring. Even the animals adapted in their own haphazard way. Coyotes sang longer at night, horses stood with their backs to the wind, and barn cats multiplied in attics like furry, meowing insulation. If you listen close, you could almost hear them arguing over who forgot to catch the mouse that got into the dried berries. And yet, through these frigid nights, something mystical persisted. A kind of patient magic, not the wand-waving sort, more the kind that whispered of endurance, of stories shared in low tones by crackling fires, of hopes hung like lanterns on the wall against the long, soundless dark. Because in the West, raw-boned, windswept, and frostbitten, they didn't just survive the cold. They transformed it into folk wisdom, tall tales, and the occasional knitted disaster. Soon, we'll step deeper into that snow-laced silence, into the final stillness that only the wildest winter night can offer, where even the wind pauses to listen. As the fire burns low and the prairie wind hums a lullaby through the knotty pine of a half-frozen cabin wall, we settle in for the final hush of this tale. Let us tip our hats one last time to the quiet warriors of chill and night, the settlers, trappers, ranchers, miners, and the occasional traveling pianist, all who braved the bitter after-sunset world of the Wild West, armed with a few woolen blankets, a cold skillet, and exactly 112 varieties of bean. Now, contrary to every dramatic cowboy movie ever made, nights in the Wild West didn't always echo with brawling saloons and distant gunshots. Most folks spent their evenings very sensibly, trying not to freeze their eyebrows off, which, by the way, was a genuine concern during especially harsh winters. Eyebrows, nature's forgotten earmuffs. When the sun blinked out behind the mountains like a shy candle, darkness slipped over the land like a velvet curtain, one rife with sharp corners and the unsettling sounds of mystery rodents. Without street lamps or porch lights, or really porches in general, the average homesteader's night routine was simple. Secure the livestock, bar the door, place the chamber pot somewhere you couldn't trip over in total darkness, and pray the wolves weren't feeling social. Inside, lanterns hissed softly with whale oil or kerosene, casting golden halos on the plank floors. The light made silhouettes dance on the walls. A mother sewing patches the size of frying pans on Junior's breeches. A father coaxing a fiddle to play something both lively and vaguely drowsy. A cat terrifying itself with its own tail. It was a warm kind of quiet, lit by stories, stew, and steam off a tin mug. For warmth, many turned to buffalo robes, handmade quilts, or that eternal heater, the cowhide companion, also known as your spouse. There was also the philosophy of huddle or die, which applied equally to families and newly made friends. If you bunked in a bunkhouse with, say, 12 other fellas, Personal space was not a concept so much as a fond, unrealistic hope. You kept your boots close, your wool socks closer, and your complaints entirely internal. Mostly because the guy next to you snored like a banjo with asthma and carried 3 Bowie knives for emotional support. Even the animals used teamwork. Horses, intelligent in ways we underappreciate, would stand close enough to share body heat and sometimes leaned against barn walls like exhausted jazz musicians waiting for their solo. Chickens huddled like feathered anarchists, ignoring all known roosting etiquette. Pigs did their best impression of heated sandbags. Everyone, regardless of species, formed a little breathing constellation of heat, but nothing defined the nighttime struggle like the parlor stove, the heavy-bellied beast of iron that was both salvation and smouldering menace. The method for keeping the coals burning all night was equal parts science, superstition, and sheer luck. It required strategic feeding just before bed. Not too much, or you roast alive. Not too little, or you wake up icicled to the blanket. There were legends of pioneers who could keep a low coal bed glowing until dawn with nothing but prayer and dried corn husks. These were not just stories, they were revered. Folk heroes with impeccable kindling instincts. And yet, amidst this nightly battle with cold and dark, people found peace. Stories were passed down, not because they were written, but because there was nothing else to listen to except each other. Stories about mountain lions that walked like sheriffs, about haunted outhouses that moaned with the wind, about Uncle Marvin's famous soup that supposedly cured frostbite and heartbreak alike, though the recipe has since been lost to unfortunate digestive reactions. Nights were quiet and long and slightly smelly, but also tender in their own odd way. A place in time where the cold taught lessons of resilience and ingenuity, and where the only thing more trusted than your dog was the mug of something hot in your hands. And as the stars spun above the silent prairie and the wind pulled its blankets tight across the land, the West slept, not always well, but always onward. Dreams of spring seeped into every frozen crevice. Dreams of green things, of laughter, of lighter coats. And now, dear listener, the fire's down to embers. The boots are by the door, and the night is still. Let sleep drift in like a snowflake, soft, slow, and just a little overdue. Good night, and pleasant, peculiar dreams from the old, cold West.